There is one date in this story that simply does not add up. And once you notice it, it becomes impossible to ignore. Almost every version of Charles and Diana's marriage begins in 1980, with a young woman working at a nursery school and photographers suddenly following her every move. But the decision that would shape, and ultimately damage, her life had already been made long before that moment. It was made years earlier, behind doors she had never walked through, by men whose names would never appear in the newspaper stories written about her. For most of his adult life, William accepted the familiar version of events. A marriage that was never truly compatible. A father whose heart belonged to someone else. A mother who suffered because of it. And a palace that managed the fallout before carrying on as usual. He had grown up inside that explanation since childhood, and over time, he had found something close to peace with it. But the version William gradually came to understand over the following 2 decades was something entirely different. It was not one explosive scandal. Nobody placed a secret document in his hands that instantly transformed everything he believed. Instead, the truth emerged slowly, piece by piece, through the work of biographers and through private accounts from people who had actually been inside those rooms during the 1970s. And when those pieces are placed together, they do not create the picture of a marriage that simply failed. I'm going to walk you through the entire sequence carefully, but I'm saving the most important part until later, because the real reason Charles chose Camilla long before Diana entered his life only makes sense once you understand what the palace already knew. Before we continue, I'm Mark Holden, and this is Mark Holden Reports. I examine the records, documents, and reporting surrounding this family, and I tell you what I believe is actually happening, not simply what the palace press office would prefer people to believe. Stay with me, because the detail almost everyone overlooked comes near the end. Some truths reach a son far too late to change anything. They arrive after the people involved have grown old, passed away, or moved beyond the point where one honest conversation could repair what happened. At that stage, the truth cannot fix the past. It can only remain there. William received one of those truths. And it did not arrive through one dramatic moment, one overheard conversation, or a single afternoon that suddenly rewrote his childhood. What emerged instead was an entire framework of decisions surrounding his family, decisions that had been made before he was even born. He spent roughly 3 decades slowly understanding the shape of that system from within it. He had grown up directly in the middle of it. There was tension in rooms he was too young to understand. Adults became careful with their language whenever certain subjects came too close. And there was a particular kind of silence that seemed to settle over the house whenever one specific name entered the conversation. Then he watched his mother sit before a television camera and bring the country to a standstill. At only 15 years old, he stood at her funeral and walked behind her coffin through central London before an audience numbering in the hundreds of millions, wearing a suit someone else had selected and walking at a pace someone else had determined. As an adult, William has spoken about that walk. And one detail he repeatedly returns to is the sound. The crowds. The horses. The strange noise created by an enormous number of people trying desperately to remain silent. A 15-year-old boy counting paving stones simply to keep himself moving down the road. That became the image Britain carried of him. And he has never truly been allowed to leave it behind, because every anniversary and every commemoration brings those pictures back onto television screens. In the years afterward, William was repeatedly given essentially the same explanation in different, carefully chosen words. Nobody had really been responsible. It had simply been tragic. His parents were mismatched, 2 people who probably should never have married. Nearly everyone around him had some reason to accept that explanation. And for a long time, William accepted it too, because a 15-year-old boy generally believes the version of events that all the adults around him appear to agree upon. Then life continued. He attended university. He served in the military. He married. Eventually, he became a father himself. And throughout those years, he carried what he believed was the complete explanation of what had happened between his parents. But it was not complete. That missing part is what matters. Because the difference between what William believed at 25 and what he understands today is not merely a collection of additional details. It changes who the story is really about. The information reached him gradually, from biographers who had genuine access, from former royal advisors who became more willing to speak after retirement, and from individuals who had witnessed conversations that were never formally recorded. No individual revelation was particularly explosive. But when all of them were considered together, they pointed toward a conclusion the official version rarely approaches. The collapse of Charles and Diana's marriage may not have been the unexpected disaster the institution later presented it as. People who closely observe William have described what this realization apparently did to him. They do not describe fury. They describe stillness. The stillness of a man who has reached the point where revelations about his own family no longer surprise him. William already understood the weight of what happened. He had carried that weight since he was 15. What changed was his understanding of where that weight had actually come from. And that is an entirely different burden to carry. Diana entered the picture in 1980 carrying almost everything the palace believed it needed. She was 19 years old, with aristocratic roots on both sides of her family, something that mattered far more to the institution at that time than people tend to admit today. She possessed a natural warmth in front of crowds that could never have been taught. And she was extraordinarily photogenic, a quality that would eventually become as much a problem for the royal household as it was an advantage. By nearly every standard the monarchy had relied upon for generations, Diana appeared to be the ideal choice. Yet people who knew her personally during those early months described something very different from the fairy tale image presented to the public. Diana was not simply being difficult. She was not inventing problems that did not exist. She had entered a household and quickly discovered an emotional space inside it that she could neither reach nor occupy, and she could not persuade her fiancé to openly acknowledge that it existed. One particular incident appears repeatedly in royal biographies, and Diana herself later described it in her recorded account. Before the wedding, she discovered a pair of gold cufflinks. They carried 2 intertwined letters. They were not Charles's initials. They were not a royal symbol or family crest. Instead, those 2 letters revealed something about the private emotional world of the man Diana was preparing to marry, something no palace briefing or private secretary had prepared her to confront. She did not take the matter to the newspapers. She confronted it privately. She asked Charles about it directly. He did not exactly deny what she suspected, nor did he give her the reassurance she was looking for. Instead, there was silence. And sometimes silence provides a clearer answer than words ever could. Think about Diana's position at that moment. She was 19 years old. She was only weeks away from participating in what would become one of the most watched weddings in history. And she was standing inside a palace holding a pair of cufflinks that raised questions about the man she was about to marry, while almost everyone surrounding her belonged professionally or personally to his world. That moment belongs near the beginning of any serious account of this marriage, not simply the famous balcony appearance that followed the wedding. Because the presence Diana was beginning to recognize had no official position in her marriage. There was no title attached to it. No formal responsibility. Nothing written into any document. Camilla Parker Bowles was simply present. She appeared at social gatherings. She existed at the other end of telephone conversations. And Diana noticed the subtle change in Charles whenever certain company was around him. People often underestimated Diana because of her age. But she was far more perceptive than many assumed. She began putting the pieces together herself, largely alone, without anyone inside the institution being willing to openly confirm what she believed she was seeing. The palace had helped place Diana in that situation. Yet it gave her almost nothing that could help her understand what she had actually entered. Consider what those first couple of years must have looked like in practical terms, because describing the situation only emotionally can hide just how isolated she was. She was still a teenager living inside an apartment located within a functioning royal building. The staff around her had served the royal household for years, sometimes decades. Their ultimate loyalty was to the institution, not necessarily to the young woman who had just entered it. Her husband could be away for extended periods because of his duties. Photographers waited outside practically every entrance she might use. And among all those people, Diana struggled to find someone she could ask a direct question and reasonably expect to receive an equally direct answer. She tried. Accounts from people who worked around Diana during that period describe her raising concerns more than once. She did it cautiously, almost like someone who already suspected that the response would be dismissive. She received kindness. She received sympathy. But she was also repeatedly encouraged to believe that perhaps she was exhausted, overwhelmed, or simply struggling to adjust to royal life. Years later, when more complete accounts began emerging, the picture looked very different. Many of the concerns Diana had developed early in the relationship were not simply products of insecurity. Once the history between Charles and Camilla is examined more closely, Diana's suspicions begin to look less like imagination and more like an attempt to understand a situation nobody was willing to explain clearly. And to understand why, the story has to move backward. Not to the wedding. Not to the engagement. Not even to the moment Diana's name first began circulating among people close to the palace. The story has to return to Charles as a young man in his early 20s, when the institution into which he had been born was already shaping what his personal future was supposed to look like. Charles and Camilla became acquainted around the early 1970s through the social circles they both occupied. Accounts from people familiar with that period tend to agree on one important point. Their connection was genuine. Camilla could make Charles laugh. Around her, he appeared comfortable in himself in a way that people who observed him closely said was relatively unusual. She brought warmth into a world dominated by formality. She could be irreverent in an environment that constantly demanded restraint. And perhaps most importantly, she seemed capable of looking at Charles as a person rather than simply seeing the title attached to him. But according to the standards maintained by the palace during that era, those qualities were not enough. Camilla was not regarded as the ideal candidate for the future king. The expectations surrounding a future queen consort in the early 1970s were extremely restrictive. Many were never formally written down. But that did not make them any less powerful. A queen consort, simply put, would be the wife of the reigning king. And in Charles's generation, the woman expected to occupy that role was judged according to conditions that had very little to do with whether Charles genuinely loved her. A complicated romantic past could count against her. A personality developed outside the discipline of royal expectations could count against her. Even independence and a life lived outside the narrow image expected of a future queen could become obstacles. According to accounts from people familiar with those discussions, the distinction made around Camilla was remarkably cold. She could be the woman whose company Charles enjoyed. But she was not considered the woman he was expected to marry. That distinction explains a remarkable amount of what happened afterward. Charles was not necessarily ordered to erase Camilla from his life overnight. Instead, the message was that she was not viewed as an acceptable future wife. Accounts describing Charles during that period portray a young man who resisted the pressure, delayed decisions, and apparently searched for some way in which his personal feelings and institutional responsibilities might coexist. But institutions like the monarchy rarely depend on one direct conversation. Pressure can operate gradually. Expectations accumulate. Advice comes repeatedly from people whose responsibility is to protect the institution. Eventually, the pressure can outlast the individual resisting it. Charles joined the Royal Navy. Distance then became part of the equation. In July 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles, an officer in the Household Cavalry, at the Guards Chapel in London. For those who believed the issue needed to be resolved, the chapter appeared finished. But look closely at the mechanism, because the same pattern appears repeatedly throughout this story. There did not need to be a dramatic order. Nobody necessarily had to sit Charles down and explicitly forbid him from doing something. The institution could instead shape the circumstances around him. A military posting here. Distance there. Expectations communicated through trusted advisors. Then time. Eventually, the outcome could appear to be a personal decision even though the conditions surrounding that decision had been carefully shaped by the institution. That is one of the ways royal machinery has historically operated. It does not always need to issue commands. Sometimes it creates circumstances in which one outcome becomes considerably easier than every alternative, and then allows that outcome to appear voluntary. But there was one question that apparently remained unresolved. What happens when you pressure someone to end a relationship emotionally when that person has never truly finished with it? The answer would begin emerging several years later. And this is where the timeline becomes extremely important. Because once the dates are placed beside one another, the familiar version of the story becomes much harder to maintain. There is a kind of deception that does not require anyone to tell an outright lie. It survives through omission, through deciding what gets discussed, where it gets discussed, and, most importantly, who is allowed to know the complete picture. Inside the Wales household during the 1980s, that appears to have been the structure surrounding Charles and Diana. It was not necessarily a secret in the traditional sense. It was more like a reality everyone close enough could recognize, but one that was rarely given a direct name in front of the person most affected by it. People familiar with royal circles during that decade have described an atmosphere that seems almost unbelievable when viewed from today. Charles and Diana maintained a shared public existence. They attended engagements together. They appeared in photographs together. They performed carefully organized royal duties before enormous crowds. From the outside, the emotional distance between them could easily be interpreted as the normal reserve of two people raised in highly formal environments. Behind that public image, however, the emotional landscape of their marriage was already changing. And those standing closest to them could see it. In her biography of Camilla, Penny Junor, drawing on people with considerable access to that social circle, placed the renewed relationship between Charles and Camilla around 1978 or 1979. If that timeline is accepted, it means the reconnect happened years before Diana entered Charles's life, before the engagement, and before the public was presented with the image of a royal fairy tale. But an important distinction needs to be made. That timing comes from one biographer's account. Other writers have placed the renewed relationship somewhat later. The precise year is disputed. The broader direction of the story, however, is much less disputed. By the period when 19-year-old Diana was preparing for her wedding, the relationship the palace had once regarded as effectively finished was no longer so simple. Different sources provide different dates. But the crucial point is the sequence. The emotional reconnect between Charles and Camilla was not simply a response to Diana becoming unhappy years into the marriage. The roots of the situation stretched much further back. And changing that sequence changes the entire interpretation. For years, the easiest version of the story was that Charles and Diana entered a marriage, the relationship deteriorated, and Charles eventually sought emotional comfort elsewhere. But if the attachment to Camilla existed before the marriage had even properly begun, the story takes on a very different shape. Multiple accounts have also suggested that Andrew Parker Bowles was not completely unaware of the complicated relationships within that social circle. People who knew him during that period have portrayed him as relatively accepting of the social environment around him and unwilling to create a public confrontation. And that brings us back to Diana and those cufflinks. Because viewed against this wider history, their meaning changes. Diana may not have been discovering something that was hidden from everyone. She may have been discovering something that had been kept unclear specifically to her. The two intertwined letters on those gold cufflinks were not merely a meaningless decoration. They represented a connection Diana was already beginning to question before her wedding. Accounts of Diana's confrontation appear in several sources, including the recording she made for Andrew Morton's project in 1991, which became the basis of his 1992 book. Her response was not simply uncontrolled anger. She questioned what she was seeing. And the answers she received did little to remove her doubts. But another confrontation would become even more famous. This time, it was not between Diana and Charles. It was between Diana and Camilla. At a social gathering, Diana approached Camilla directly. Other people were close enough that the encounter would later become part of the public record. Diana had spent enough time observing the situation to reach her own conclusion. And she finally addressed it. Her message was painfully simple. She wanted her husband. She understood that Camilla remained emotionally significant to Charles, but Diana wanted her own marriage. The extraordinary part of the confrontation was not its aggression. It was how much resignation sat underneath it. The Princess of Wales had reached a point where she felt she was competing for a place inside her own marriage. Neither woman needed a long explanation. By then, both understood the situation they were discussing. Charles's emotional choices had been shaped years before, and now everyone involved was living with the consequences. That encounter matters because it briefly placed Diana and Camilla inside the same emotional space without the usual layers surrounding royal life. There were no palace advisors standing between them. No official press statement could translate the conversation afterward. No carefully constructed public explanation could change what the two women already understood. Diana left that encounter and continued with her responsibilities. She still had years of royal engagements ahead of her, and she continued performing them. Much of what we have covered so far has been examined repeatedly by royal biographers, even if individual details and dates remain disputed. But the next part is where the story becomes considerably more complicated. Across several decades, different royal biographers have spoken with individuals who had varying levels of access to palace decision-making during the 1970s and 1980s. Taken together, some of those accounts suggest that senior advisors understood the strength of Charles's attachment to Camilla before Diana became the central figure in the marriage discussion. They knew the relationship had history. They understood that Charles's feelings were significant. And some later accounts suggest that at least certain people around the institution may have questioned whether marriage alone would completely erase that attachment. Consider what that possibility would mean. The people responsible for assessing Diana, preparing her for royal life, briefing her, and guiding her toward marriage may have understood far more about Charles's emotional history than Diana herself did. And ironically, the characteristics that made Diana appear ideal to the institution may also have made her especially vulnerable. Her youth, her limited experience, her relatively uncomplicated romantic history, her suitability for the public image expected from a future queen. Those qualities made her easier to present as the perfect royal bride. But they did not necessarily prepare her for the emotional complexity waiting behind the palace doors. Stripped of the fairy tale presentation, the selection process looks considerably colder. The institution was not simply considering romantic compatibility. It was considering suitability, stability, public presentation, and whether the future Princess of Wales could adapt to the demands placed upon her. But there is an important limit to what can responsibly be claimed. There is no publicly established memo proving that senior palace officials deliberately selected Diana while knowingly expecting Charles to continue an emotional relationship elsewhere. Many of the private conversations from that period were never recorded publicly, and many of the people involved died without giving complete accounts. So this cannot honestly be presented as a proven verdict. What exists is a pattern reconstructed from biographies, testimony, and the known behavior of the institution. And throughout modern royal history, whenever personal emotion has collided with institutional continuity, the institution has usually prioritized its own survival. Diana entered that system at 19. Think about what that meant. Her family background was examined. Her temperament was considered. Her suitability was evaluated by older officials with decades of experience inside royal life. People discussed whether she could adapt to the responsibilities waiting for her. Yet underneath all those assessments sat a question far more personal than anything written on a suitability checklist. How much did Diana actually know about the emotional history of the man she was preparing to marry? And if she had known everything from the beginning, would she still have walked toward that wedding? That is the question the official story has never been able to answer completely. The accumulated weight of this history did not reach William in one dramatic revelation. It came gradually. Through biographies. Through private accounts. Through the recollections of people who had watched those years unfold from inside or close to the royal household. And according to those who have observed William closely, his response was not explosive anger. It was something quieter. A lasting change in the way he understood the institution he had been born to eventually lead. The focus was not simply on his father. It was on the institution itself. Behind that change sat an uncomfortable question. If people inside the system understood what was happening, how much responsibility did they carry for what followed? William has never publicly stood before a microphone and asked that question directly. But it is difficult to imagine that the question has never crossed his mind. Especially because the same institution that shaped his parents' lives is the institution he is expected to inherit. That gives his future role an unusual dimension. Previous heirs could approach the monarchy largely through the traditions and expectations handed down to them. William approaches it while also carrying intimate knowledge of what institutional decisions can do to a family. He knows what happened to his mother. And he also understands that the people making those decisions were not necessarily behaving like villains in a simple story. Many of them likely believed they were fulfilling their responsibilities. Their priority was protecting the continuity of an institution that had survived for centuries. That is what makes the entire story so uncomfortable. There does not need to have been one person deliberately attempting to destroy Diana's life. Royal advisors were protecting the crown. Charles was attempting to balance expectations placed upon him from birth with his own emotional life. Camilla was navigating her own circumstances. And Diana, still only 19 when the process began, entered the middle of all those competing interests. Over the following years, the consequences played out publicly while the machinery around them continued functioning. Now look at the way William manages his own household. Observers have often noted a smaller circle, fewer layers between family decisions, and a greater emphasis on keeping certain matters within the immediate household. Nobody has officially declared that this approach exists because of what happened to Diana. But viewed against his childhood, the contrast is difficult to miss. And that leads to another part of Diana's story that often gets simplified. There is a familiar public image of Diana as a young woman overwhelmed by forces much larger than herself. That image contains truth. But it is incomplete. Diana was also observing. She was learning how the institution operated. She was beginning to understand how information moved, how public narratives were created, and how quickly her own version of events could disappear if she did not preserve it herself. Her cooperation with Andrew Morton did not emerge from nowhere. Accounts of how the project developed describe a woman who had spent considerable time organizing her memories before her words were recorded. She understood what she wanted documented. She understood which experiences mattered. And she appears to have understood that once the material became public, the institutional response could be severe. The recordings themselves are remarkable because Diana spoke privately into a recording device rather than sitting across from a journalist conducting a conventional interview. The result was unusually direct. They preserve her own account before someone else could define that account for her. When the material became public, the relationship between Diana and the institution deteriorated further. Her official position changed over time. Her household arrangements changed. And after the divorce, her relationship with royal protection and the wider institution was fundamentally different from what it had been while she was a working member of the family. Each individual change could be explained as part of separation and divorce. But placed together, they illustrate how thoroughly Diana was becoming detached from the structure that had once surrounded her. Then came the Panorama interview in November 1995. Around 23 million viewers in Britain watched the broadcast. It became one of the defining moments of Diana's public life. For years, it was often remembered as evidence of a royal marriage collapsing openly on television. But another interpretation is possible. Diana appeared controlled and deliberate. She was using a national television audience to explain the difference between the public version of her marriage and the experience she believed she had actually lived. There is, however, an essential part of the record that cannot be ignored. The BBC's investigation, led by Lord Dyson, published in 2021, concluded that Martin Bashir had used deceitful methods in securing the interview. The BBC subsequently apologised. William publicly responded to those findings and said the failure surrounding the interview had contributed significantly to his mother's fear, paranoia, and isolation during her final years. That finding changes how the circumstances surrounding the interview must be understood. But it does not erase the fact that Diana chose to speak about her marriage once she was sitting before the camera. Her words became part of the historical record. She described a marriage complicated by the presence of another relationship. And over the decades that followed, numerous accounts of Charles, Diana, and Camilla would continue examining the same basic emotional triangle. The controversy surrounding Panorama, therefore, contains two separate issues. One concerns the unethical methods used to obtain Diana's participation. The other concerns what Diana herself believed and chose to say about her life. Those issues should not be confused. Diana had spent years believing that important parts of her experience were being minimized or questioned. Panorama gave her an enormous audience for her own account. But there was another consequence that cannot be overlooked. William and Harry were still children. William was 13. Harry was 11. Their parents' private conflict had become international television. Charles had concerns about the impact on their sons, and those concerns were not unreasonable. That is one reason this story refuses to divide neatly into heroes and villains. Different people could have legitimate grievances while still participating in a situation that caused enormous damage. And the institutions surrounding them repeatedly struggled to resolve that conflict before it became public. For William, the grief that followed would not arrive as one single event. Some grief arrives instantly. Other grief comes in pieces. Each piece seems manageable on its own. Only years later, when you try to understand all of it together, do you realize how much you have been carrying. William was 15 when Diana died. He was old enough to understand exactly what losing his mother meant. He was also old enough to have already formed impressions about his parents' relationship, impressions no teenager should have been required to navigate. After Diana's death, the adults surrounding William faced an impossible situation. Certain conversations could wait. Perhaps they believed he needed to become older first. Perhaps they believed the grief needed time to settle. Perhaps everyone assumed there would eventually be a better moment to explain everything. But that perfect moment never arrived. And according to the accounts available publicly, William and Charles never appear to have had one complete conversation capable of resolving every unanswered question left by those years. That does not mean their relationship is cold. Quite the opposite. People who have observed father and son over the years have described genuine warmth between them. There is affection. There is respect. And there is the shared understanding of a responsibility and pressure almost nobody outside their family can fully experience. But affection does not automatically erase unresolved history. William can love his father while still carrying difficult questions about the decisions Charles made. Both things can exist at the same time. And that complexity is essential to understanding what came next. Understanding what happened to his father and accepting it emotionally are two very different things. According to people familiar with William's outlook, he has not spent his adult life trying to build a case against Charles. Instead, he appears capable of viewing his father's position with more complexity than many outsiders might expect. William understands that Charles himself was shaped by the institution. As a young man, Charles had been surrounded by expectations about whom he could marry, what kind of relationship was acceptable, and how his private life should fit into his future role. The system offered him very little room to reconcile the difference between personal desire and institutional responsibility. But understanding why someone made certain choices does not automatically mean those choices stop hurting. Acceptance and peace are not the same thing. People close to William have described something resembling practical acceptance. Enough acceptance to sit beside his father during important state occasions. Enough to appear alongside him at royal engagements. Enough to continue serving the same institution and eventually inherit responsibility from him. But practical acceptance cannot replace a conversation that may never have fully happened. The kind of conversation where a father and son sit together without advisors, ceremonies, or carefully chosen public language and speak openly about what those years actually meant. As far as the public record shows, there is no evidence that one complete conversation of that kind has ever resolved everything between them. And so two men who clearly care about each other have continued working within the same institution, while decades of complicated family history remain between them. That unresolved history appears whenever Diana returns to the public conversation. Every anniversary of her death. Every documentary. Every memorial. Every unveiling. Every time a reporter asks William or Charles a question connected to her and waits for a reaction. Both men have learned to navigate those moments publicly. What happened privately is far less clear. Charles is now in the later stage of his life, and Buckingham Palace announced in February 2024 that he had been diagnosed with cancer. That reality gives unresolved conversations a different weight. Time is not unlimited. Diana was only 36 when she died. William eventually became older than his mother had ever been. That milestone carries its own emotional significance. There is something uniquely difficult about reaching an age your parent never had the chance to reach. The unanswered questions do not necessarily become lighter. Sometimes they become heavier. Eventually, every private royal conflict reaches a point where it becomes public. For the House of Windsor, one of those defining moments arrived in 1995. The Panorama interview did not simply reveal problems inside a marriage. It exposed the widening distance between the official image of that marriage and Diana's own description of what had happened behind palace walls. 4 years, those two versions had existed beside each other. The palace maintained one public framework. Diana increasingly carried another. The interview made the gap impossible to ignore. And the reaction went far beyond Britain. International commentators who had once treated Charles and Diana's marriage as a glamorous royal story began reconsidering the framework through which they understood the family. The fairy tale was disappearing. In its place was something more complicated, a story involving institutional expectations, private relationships, public image, and individuals struggling inside a system much larger than themselves. Within Britain, the debate also became broader than one failed marriage. People began asking what the monarchy existed to protect. Was its first responsibility toward the individuals inside it? Or toward the continuity of the crown itself? The years that followed produced one of the most remarkable transformations in modern royal public relations. Camilla's public position gradually changed. She had once been portrayed by much of the public and press as the central outsider in Charles and Diana's marriage. Eventually, she would stand beside Charles as queen. That transformation did not happen overnight. It happened slowly. Appearances became more frequent. Her public role expanded carefully. She became associated with causes and responsibilities that allowed people to see her outside the old scandal. And time itself changed the emotional temperature surrounding the story. Charles and Camilla married on April 9, 2005, at Windsor Guildhall. By then, public attitudes had already begun shifting substantially from where they had been a decade earlier. The method is worth noticing. There was no single announcement demanding that the public suddenly reconsider Camilla. Instead, acceptance developed gradually. She appeared more often. Her responsibilities increased. The institution allowed familiarity to do what argument probably could not. And over time, the woman who had once been considered unsuitable for Charles became integrated into the monarchy. There is an extraordinary symmetry in that transformation. The same institution that had once created conditions separating Charles and Camilla eventually created conditions allowing their relationship to become publicly accepted. But there was one person who could never participate in that later chapter: Diana. She had died before the rehabilitation of Camilla truly gathered momentum. And that absence changed everything. By the time Charles and Camilla's relationship became normalized publicly, Diana could no longer respond, reinterpret events, or add anything further to her own account. Then came May 6, 2023, the coronation of King Charles III. By every ceremonial measure, it represented the monarchy operating at full strength. Centuries of tradition, elaborate symbolism, carefully planned movement, every detail designed to communicate continuity. At the center of that ceremony stood Charles, and beside him stood Camilla. The woman once regarded as unsuitable for the future king was now being crowned queen. Millions watched the ceremony itself, but people interested in the deeper family history also watched William. He remained composed. He fulfilled every ceremonial responsibility expected of him. He stood where protocol required. He moved when the ceremony required. His public discipline was complete. Whatever William privately felt about that moment remained private. And it is important not to turn facial expressions or brief pauses into evidence of emotions we cannot actually know. What can be said is that the ceremony carried enormous family symbolism. William was watching his father become king. He was watching Camilla formally occupy the position beside him. And all of it occurred within the same institution in which his mother had once served as Princess of Wales. Diana was not a central part of the coronation ceremony. Her name did not need to be spoken for her history to remain relevant to anyone familiar with the family's past. For William especially, that history could never simply disappear. His mother had once occupied a position within the royal structure. Her life, marriage, separation, and death had shaped William long before he became the senior royal figure the public sees today. Whatever emotions existed during the coronation belonged to him. He did not publicly explain them. That restraint itself reflects something William has practiced for most of his life. He grew up watching two very different approaches to public conflict. Diana eventually spoke openly about her experiences. Charles remained considerably more restrained about many aspects of the marriage. William witnessed the consequences surrounding both approaches. And perhaps one of the clearest lessons he appears to have carried forward is the value of controlling what he reveals publicly. There was another important detail about the coronation. Every major element had been planned months in advance. The order of service, the seating arrangements, the ceremonial movements, the prayers, the music. Nothing of that scale happens accidentally. Decisions are made about what the ceremony will emphasize and what it will leave outside the official narrative. Diana was not given a formal place in that story. That does not prove a deliberate attempt to erase her. But it does illustrate something the monarchy has repeatedly done with difficult chapters of its history. It moves forward. The institution emphasizes continuity. Complications from previous generations gradually become history rather than active parts of the official present. But public memory does not always operate the same way. And Diana remains one of the clearest examples. Charles ultimately married the woman he had wanted decades earlier. That is part of the historical record. Camilla eventually became queen. The institution that once regarded her as unsuitable ultimately placed a crown on her head. That distance, from rejection to acceptance, took roughly half a century to close. But another distance remained. Diana did not live long enough to see how the story would eventually be rewritten by time. She remains permanently fixed in public memory at 36. And because she never grew old, never entered another long public chapter, and never had decades to reshape her image, the version of Diana carried by the public has an unusual permanence. Camilla, meanwhile, survived decades of intense hostility. The institution eventually changed. The rules became flexible. But by the time that happened, the lives affected by those earlier expectations had already been permanently altered. The old rule had already changed, but only after the damage was done. 3 people had spent decades living with the consequences of standards that the institution itself would eventually abandon. Charles spent years caught between the marriage expected of him and the relationship he had never completely left behind. Camilla spent decades carrying the reputation of being one of the most unpopular women in Britain. And Diana lived inside a story without ever being given the complete beginning. In the end, the rule that had shaped all 3 lives turned out not to be permanent. It could be changed. By 2005, everyone could see that. But William was left carrying everything that came before it. A father he loves. A mother he lost. And an understanding of how those 2 realities became connected through decisions made long before he was old enough to comprehend them. One day, William will become king. He will occupy the same position his father holds today and lead the same institution that shaped the lives of both his parents. But he will enter that responsibility with a different understanding of its history. He knows what institutional decisions can cost the people living inside them. He has experienced that cost personally. And yet he will continue serving the monarchy because that is what generations of this family have done with problems they could never fully resolve. They carry them forward. And this is the detail that remains hardest to ignore. In the early 1970s, the palace looked at Camilla Parker Bowles and concluded that she was not the appropriate woman for the future king to marry. But the situation was not resolved simply by making Charles forget her. Instead, circumstances changed. Distance was created. Expectations were reinforced. And eventually another woman entered the picture. Diana was only 19. She was young, aristocratic, publicly appealing, and almost perfectly suited to the image the institution wanted beside its future king. But she was entering a situation whose history she did not fully understand. She could not ask questions about facts nobody had properly explained to her. And by the time she began discovering the emotional reality surrounding her marriage, the wedding had already transformed her private life into a national institution. She spent years absorbing the consequences. Then history completed one of its strangest circles. The woman once considered unsuitable eventually married Charles. Years later, she stood beside him as queen. The standards that had once kept Charles and Camilla apart had changed enough for the monarchy itself to accept their marriage. But Diana never received the opportunity to see that transformation. She was gone. And that is what makes the sequence so difficult to dismiss. The institution eventually accepted the relationship it had once resisted. It eventually crowned the woman who had once been considered unsuitable. But the young woman who had entered the middle of that unresolved history had already paid an enormous personal price. Diana was never simply the wrong woman for Charles. She was a young woman placed inside a situation whose full history she had never been given. And perhaps that is the harshest truth William has had to confront. The marriage did not begin with 2 people discovering they were incompatible. Its roots stretched backward into decisions, expectations, relationships, and institutional judgments made years before Diana walked through the palace doors. William cannot rewrite any of that. He cannot give his mother another life. He cannot return to those rooms and demand different decisions from people who are no longer there. And he cannot separate his father from the institution that shaped him. What William can do is decide what happens when that institution eventually becomes his responsibility. Because the real inheritance waiting for him is not only a crown. It is the knowledge of what happened before it reached him. And the question that remains is whether knowing the truth will finally be enough to stop the same machinery from repeating the mistakes of the past.